They found me in the lowest hold of the recaptured slave vessel, sitting in exactly 3 centimeters of my own waist, staring at a wall that held nothing worth seeing. I was alive, technically. My heart's beat, my lungs processed oxygen, my eyes tracked movement when the Imperial Navy rescue team entered with their glow globes and hazard suits and expressions of professional disgust at what the Xenos had left behind. But I wasn't there. Not really. The medic who examined me later, a tired man named Surgeon Lieutenant Kolas, who'd seen too many Drukhari victims to maintain the fiction of hope, described my condition as catastrophic psychological trauma with complete dissociative shutdown. His report, which I read years later when some fragment of awareness had returned, noted that I responded to exactly one stimulus, the name I'd had before they took me. Castor Ven, they'd said, testing names against faces until they found the one that made my eyes focus for exactly 2 seconds before sliding back into whatever internal landscape had become my only reality. The report recommended immediate termination as an act of mercy. The Munitorum overruled it. I was salvageable genetic material, and the Imperium wastes nothing that can be recycled, even broken men whose minds had been so thoroughly destroyed that consciousness itself had become an act of torture. But let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you about the 147 hours between the man I was and the empty thing they recovered. Let me tell you what the Drukhari, the ones Imperial propaganda calls the Dark Eldar, so as if giving them ominous names makes them less real, do when they want to break someone not through pain, but through love. My name was Castor Ven. I was 29 years old. I had a husband named Marcus, and we'd submitted genetic samples to the Administratum for reproduction licensing 3 months before the raid. And I still believed then that the Emperor's servants would protect us, that faith meant something, that the system we served cared whether we lived or died. They'd conditioned us well. Hive Tertius wasn't a good place to live. No hive world offered anything resembling good, but it was ours. And that meant something when you'd been born in its recycled air and learned to sleep through the constant grinding of manufactorum machinery that rattled through the hab blocks like metallic breathing. And I worked the generatorium in sub-level 47, maintaining the power distribution systems that kept 300,000 people alive through the bitter cold of Demeter 7's 13-month winters. It was dangerous work. Electrical discharge could flash fry a human in microseconds, and the machinery was ancient enough that safety protocols were suggestions rather than guarantees. But it paid enough to afford a 2-room hab unit and regular corpse starch rations instead of the recycled protein paste they fed the lower workers. Marcus worked data entry in the Administratum processing centers, 17 levels above me. We'd met during a mandatory Imperial worship service. Attendance was tracked by Servo Skull to ensure compliance, and discovered we both found the same bitter amusement in the contradiction between the priest's promises of divine protection and the reality of daily survival in the hive's depths. The Emperor protects, the priest had intoned while we stood in formation with 3,000 other workers, breathing incense that made my head swim and my thoughts feel sluggish. I recognized later that the sacred smoke contained mild psychoactive compounds designed to increase suggestibility, but at the time I simply accepted it as normal. This was worship. This was faith. The Emperor protects, we repeated in unison, our voices blending into a sound that felt less like prayer and more like factory machinery. Repetitive, mechanical, mindless. Now Marcus had looked at me afterward, his eyes showing the same drugged compliance mine probably reflected, and said quietly, "If he protects, why do we need to maintain the heating systems? Shouldn't divine providence keep us warm?" It was a small heresy, barely worth noting, but it made me laugh, and laughter was rare enough in the hive that I treasured it. We registered our partnership 3 months later. Imperial law required genetic compatibility screening and reproduction licensing before sanctioning bonds, another layer of bureaucratic control disguised as social organization. The administratum took our genetic samples, processed them through their databases, and granted us provisional licensing for one offspring to be produced when economic circumstances permitted. We were fortunate, they told us. Some workers waited years for licensing. Some never received it at all, their genetic profiles deemed insufficient for imperial needs. We should have been grateful, they suggested. We should have praised the Emperor for this blessing. And we did. Because you didn't question the system. You served it, you thanked it for the privilege of serving it, and you told yourself the suffering had meaning. The Drukhari came during the night cycle, when most of Hive Tertius's population was in mandated rest period, and the defensive batteries were operating on minimum crew. I learned later that they'd been watching the Hive for months, studying our routines and defensive patterns, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The Xenos were patient when it suited their purposes. They had millennia to perfect their hunting techniques, when humans were plentiful enough that individual raids could be planned with the precision of surgical strikes. The first indication something was wrong came through the Vox system, an emergency broadcast that interrupted the mandatory imperial hymns they played during rest cycles to reinforce conditioning even in sleep. All citizens proceed to designated shelter positions. This is not a drill. Hostile Xenos contact confirmed in levels 20 through 60. The Emperor protects. All citizens proceed. The broadcast cut off mid-sentence, replaced by a sound like screaming rendered into static. Marcus was already moving, grabbing our emergency supplies, water rations, a hand lamp, and the small stub pistol I'd acquired through technically illegal means because I'd learned early that Imperial protection was propaganda and actual survival required preparation they didn't officially sanction. "The shelter is 4 levels down," he said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see tightening his jaw. "If we move now..." The wall exploded inward, not with fire or explosives, but with a precision that suggested the material had simply been convinced to stop existing. One moment, there was a solid wall of reinforced rockcrete. The next, there was a hole large enough for figures to pour through, tall, impossibly graceful figures that moved like dancers and killed like industrial machinery. Drukhari. I'd seen propaganda images, but they hadn't captured the visceral wrongness of seeing them in person. They wore armor that looked like screaming faces fused with bladed edges, carried weapons that hummed with energies I couldn't identify, and their eyes, alien, ancient, cruel beyond any human comprehension of the word, assessed us with the cold precision of technicians evaluating machinery. One spoke, and though I didn't know the Xeno's tongue, the translation device it wore rendered its words into flat, emotionless Gothic. These two. Genetic compatibility confirmed. Harvest them. I raised the stub pistol, my hands shaking but my training, such as it was, holding. I fired 3 times. The first shot went wide, the second struck one of the Drukhari center mass and did absolutely nothing, the primitive bullet apparently unable to penetrate whatever force field protected its armor. The third never left the barrel because something struck my arm with enough force to shatter the radius and ulna, sending bone fragments through muscle in a configuration of damage that would have made me scream if I'd had time before something else. Some kind of neural disruptor sent electricity through my body that bypassed pain and went straight to enforced paralysis. I collapsed, conscious but immobile, and watched the Drukhari take Marcus with the same efficient brutality. He tried to fight, managed to land one punch that connected with a Xenos face hard enough to split his knuckles on its angular features, and was rendered unconscious for his effort with a device that pressed against his temple and simply shut down his higher brain functions. They carried us through the hole in the wall, through corridors that definitely weren't part of Hive Tertius's architecture, and into a vehicle that shouldn't have been able to fit in the spaces it navigated through. The Drukhari had technology that violated physics as I understood them, Their ships moved through dimensions Imperial science claimed didn't exist. Their weapons killed in ways that bypassed conventional armor, and their medicine could keep humans alive through injuries that should have caused immediate death. This last capability, I would learn, was not mercy. It was simply that they needed their victims alive for the entertainment to have meaning. The journey to whatever location the Drukhari called home. I never learned its name, never saw anything that would let me map its position, took either hours or days or weeks. Time became unreliable when you were paralyzed in the back of a Xenos transport, conscious but unable to move or speak, watching other captives slowly realize the horror of their situation. During that transport, drugged and immobile, and trying desperately to maintain some core of self before the fear consumed it entirely. I thought about my father. He'd been a generatorium technician too, had trained me in the profession before the Hive's educational administratum made it official. I remembered being 8 years old, standing in our HAB unit while he showed me circuit diagrams drawn on recycled parchment, his calloused fingers tracing power flows. "Electricity is like water, Castor," he'd said, his voice patient in ways the official instructors never were. "It follows the path of least resistance. And you can't force it where it doesn't want to go. You have to understand how it moves naturally, then build channels that guide it safely." "What happens if you build the channels wrong?" I'd asked. "Then it finds its own path, usually through something important. Or someone." He'd shown me his left hand, where 2 fingers ended in scar tissue instead of normal digits. That's how I learned to be careful, paid attention to the details after that. It was a small memory, insignificant in the vast scope of a human life. But it was mine, and in that Xenos transport, with my freedom ending and my future unknown, I clung to it desperately. My father had died 3 years later, his body consumed by radiation poisoning from a generatorium malfunction that the administratum classified as acceptable operational loss. They'd given our family a small compensation payment and told us we should be proud he'd died in service to the Emperor. "The Emperor protects," the priest had said during the mandated memorial service. But he hadn't protected my father, and he wouldn't protect me. That truth was becoming harder to deny with each passing moment in Xenos captivity. The place where they took us, I never learned if it was a ship or a station or something that existed outside normal spatial categories, smelled wrong. Not just alien, but chemically wrong. Like the air itself had been treated with compounds designed to trigger specific neurological responses in human biochemistry. Later, when I could think clearly enough to analyze my experiences, I recognized the scent as a combination of pheromones and synthetic hormones that enhanced fear response while suppressing logical reasoning. They were drugging us through the air itself, preparing our minds for whatever horror they'd planned. The Drukhari processed their captives with assembly line efficiency. We were stripped of clothing and belongings, our bodies scanned with devices that mapped every biological system in detail that would have impressed Imperial Medici if they'd had access to the technology. They catalogued our genetic profiles, cross-referenced us against databases I couldn't comprehend, and sorted us into categories whose purposes remained unclear. Most captives were herded into holding pens, large chambers that held hundreds of humans in conditions that barely sustained life. I saw men and boys of all ages, some dressed in Imperial Guard uniforms, others in civilian clothing, a few in the tattered remains of what might have been Arbet's armor. The Drukhari were indiscriminate in their hunting. They took whoever they could capture, regardless of status or function. But Marcus and I were separated from the general population, along with perhaps 20 others, and taken to a different section whose cleaner architecture and more sophisticated equipment suggested a special purpose. A Drukhari wearing robes that incorporated living faces. I could see them blinking, mouths moving in silent screams, addressed us in Gothic, rendered flat by translation tech. Thus, you have been selected for specialized processing, it said, its tone suggesting this was an honor rather than a death sentence. Your genetic profiles indicate optimal compatibility for accelerated reproduction protocols. You will contribute to an experiment of significant scientific value. I didn't understand what that meant. Not then. Marcus, standing beside me with his hands restrained and his face showing the kind of controlled terror that came from years of surviving hive life by not showing weakness, asked the question I was too afraid to voice. What kind of experiment? The Drukhari's face, angular, ancient, cruel, shifted into what might have been a smile. One that will expand your understanding of suffering beyond what your limited species normally experiences. We have found that physical pain, while entertaining, ours has limitations. But emotional pain... It paused, and I saw something in its expression that was worse than cruelty. Genuine scientific curiosity. Emotional pain can be infinite if properly applied, and we have become very skilled at application. They separated us after that. Marcus taken one direction, me taken another, both of us aware we might never see each other again, but unable to do anything except exist in whatever nightmare the Xenos had designed. I was brought to a chamber that looked like surgical theater crossed with torture gallery. The walls were lined with equipment I couldn't identify, devices that combined medical precision with artistic flourish in ways that suggested function and aesthetics were equally valued. Everything was spotlessly clean, and the kind of sterile environment that made the horror worse because it meant this wasn't random violence. It was organized, systematic, refined through generations of practice. 3 Drukhari waited in the chamber, all wearing the same robes that incorporated living faces. I recognized them later as homunculi, the flesh crafters, the ones who'd taken biological manipulation and refined it into an art form that made imperial medici look like primitives drawing on cave walls. One spoke, and its voice carried a note of excitement that made my skin crawl. Subject Ven Castor. Age 29 standard years, genetic profile optimal. Reproduction licensing granted 3 months prior to capture. Recent contribution to gene bank for sanctioned offspring production. It knew everything. They'd accessed imperial databases, or tortured the information from administratum personnel, or simply scanned my body and extracted my entire medical history from genetic markers. We have a question for you, Subject Ven, the homunculus continued. Would you like to meet your sons? I didn't understand what it was asking. Marcus and I had submitted samples, yes, but production was years away, contingent on economic conditions and administrative approval and a dozen other bureaucratic requirements. I don't have sons, I said, my voice rough from fear and dehydration. Not yet, it agreed. But you have genetic material stored in our laboratories. Samples taken during your capture, viable for reproduction. We can create your offspring. That we can accelerate their growth from conception to maturity in time frames that would seem miraculous by your species standards. It gestured to a medical bay where devices hummed with barely audible frequencies. We can grow your son from single cell to full adulthood in approximately 9 hours, and we can do this repeatedly, using your genetic material, creating thousands of children you'll never know except in the moments of their births and deaths. I understood then. Not the full scope. My mind couldn't process the full scope, but enough to know this was worse than any physical torture they could have devised. Why? I asked, the question emerging before I could stop it. The homunculus tilted its head, considering. Because suffering is our art form and we have exhausted simpler mediums, and physical pain is limited by biology. Bodies break, consciousness fades, death provides escape. But emotional suffering. It made a gesture that might have been appreciation. Emotional suffering can be refined indefinitely. The love a parent feels for offspring, that bond your species uses to ensure genetic continuation, can be weaponized with proper application. We will make you love them, each one, individually, and then we will make you watch them suffer. 1,000 times, 1,000 sons who will look to you for protection you cannot provide, 1,000 deaths you will be unable to prevent. It paused, and I saw something flicker in its expression that might have been genuine scientific curiosity. We want to know if consciousness can survive that. If the human psyche remains intact after experiencing the death of 1,000 children, each one genetically connected to you, each one briefly aware before termination. The Imperium's propaganda claims human resilience is formidable. We intend to test that claim thoroughly. And then it began. They restrained me carefully, not to prevent escape, but to position me optimally for observation. I was locked in a chair that adjusted to my body's exact dimensions, my head held immobile by a device that prevented me from looking away. My eyelids clamped open with mechanical precision that would have seemed comical if it weren't so horrifying. I would watch everything. That was the point. The homunculi worked with the practiced efficiency of master craftsmen, their movements coordinated through centuries of joint operations. And they combined my genetic material with accelerants and growth hormones and technologies I couldn't begin to comprehend, creating something that shouldn't have been possible. A functional human fetus that developed at rates thousands of times faster than natural biology permitted. I watched the process on screens positioned at eye level, watched a single cell divide and multiply, watched an embryo form, its structure following human developmental patterns in compressed time frames that made my mind struggle to process what I was seeing, watched features emerge, fingers, toes, a face that carried markers from my genetic line and markers I recognized from Marcus's profile. This was our son, growing in an artificial womb at speeds that violated every natural law, brought into existence for the sole purpose of teaching me suffering. On hour 1, the fetus reached equivalent of first trimester development. I could see its heart beating, a rhythmic pulse that biological imperative insisted I care about, even though rational thought screamed. This was wrong. This was violation. This shouldn't exist. Hour 2, second trimester equivalent. The features were more defined now. I could see the shape of his face, could imagine what he might look like as a child if he were ever permitted to be one. The homunculi monitored the growth with casual attention, making minor adjustments to hormone levels and nutrient feeds. Hour 3. Birth. They extracted him from the artificial womb with the same clinical precision they'd applied to his creation. He was fully formed, viable, and a human infant who breathed and cried and looked around with newborn confusion at an environment that held nothing familiar or comforting. One of the homunculi held him up for my inspection. Your first son, subject Ven. Genetically yours, created from samples taken at capture. Would you like to name him? I tried not to answer. Tried to maintain some emotional distance that would let me survive this, but biological imperatives don't care about survival strategies. My brain recognized this as my child, and some deep programming insisted I acknowledge it. Jaren, I heard myself say, the name emerging without conscious thought. It had been my grandfather's name, passed down through generations, and some part of me wanted this child to have something from his heritage, even if that heritage was about to be destroyed. Jaren, the homunculus repeated, as if recording it for later reference. A name carries meaning in human psychology. Thank you for providing that additional data point. Then it placed the infant in another device, a cradle that wasn't a cradle, a machine designed to continue the accelerated growth with the baby suspended in nutrient solution that would develop his body from infant to child to adolescent to adult in the remaining hours. The worst part wasn't the speed. It was that I could see him developing consciousness. Hour 4, toddler equivalent. He was moving now, his limbs coordinated enough for basic motor function. His eyes tracked movement, showed awareness of his environment. And he saw me, recognized something in my face that biological programming insisted was important. "Da," he said, with the first word emerging with toddler imprecision. Not a word they'd taught him. The homunculi weren't providing any socialization or education. Just a sound that human children are genetically programmed to associate with parental figures. I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart. That was too metaphorical. Something more fundamental, some barrier I'd been maintaining between my consciousness and the full horror of this situation. This was my son. Created artificially, grown at impossible speeds, brought into existence for torture. But my brain didn't care about the circumstances. It recognized genetic connection and activated every parental instinct evolution had installed over millions of years. I loved him, instantly, completely, against every rational objection my mind could formulate. And the homunculi knew it. So I could see them recording my physiological responses, heart rate elevation, hormonal changes, the neurological patterns that indicated emotional bonding. This was what they wanted. This was the experiment. Hour 5, child equivalent, perhaps 6 or 7 years old in developmental terms. He was talking now, his vocabulary expanding as his accelerated brain developed language capacity at rates that seemed impossible. He asked questions. Where was he? Who were the strange people? Why did everything hurt? Why couldn't he remember anything before waking up? I couldn't answer. The restraints prevented speech beyond single words, and even those words were monitored, recorded, analyzed for data that would refine future experiments. He started crying when no answers came, and the universal response of children confronted with circumstances beyond their comprehension. He called for me, "Da, please help," and I was completely unable to provide any comfort. Hour 6. Adolescent equivalent. He'd stopped crying, had developed enough cognitive capacity to understand he was trapped, that the beings surrounding him weren't human and didn't care about his suffering. He looked at me with eyes that carried Marcus's shape and my father's color, and I saw him realize I wasn't going to save him. "Why?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why did you let them do this?" I didn't have an answer that would matter. Hour 7. Young adult equivalent. Jaren had reached full physical maturity, his body developed to approximately 20 years old in standard aging. He'd been alive for 7 hours and experienced the equivalent of 2 decades of development, compressed into time frames that had left his consciousness fragmented and unstable. The homunculi began the next phase of their experiment. They introduced pain systematically, using it to map his neurological responses with scientific precision. They started with minor injuries, small cuts, brief electrical shocks, and carefully measured how his enhanced development had affected his pain threshold and recovery rates. He screamed. Not because the pain was overwhelming yet, but because he understood with adult consciousness that this was only the beginning, that whatever they were doing would escalate, that there was no escape or rescue. He looked at me throughout the process, his eyes holding questions I couldn't answer. "Why aren't you helping? Why did you create me for this? What kind of parent watches their child suffer?" I tried to close my eyes, tried to retreat into unconsciousness that would spare me from witnessing, but the devices holding my eyelids open were sophisticated enough to detect neural attempts at dissociation and administered stimulants directly to my bloodstream that forced full conscious awareness. I would watch every moment. That was the point. Hour 8. The torture escalated to major injuries. They broke his bones systematically, starting with fingers and progressing to larger structures. They pierced his organs with instruments designed to cause maximum pain while preventing fatal damage. They burned him with chemicals that shouldn't have existed, that made his skin blister and peel in patterns that suggested artistic intent rather than random cruelty. And they kept him alive through it all, their medical technology sophisticated enough to prevent shock or system failure, maintaining consciousness regardless of injury severity. Jaren stopped screaming somewhere in hour 8. Not because the pain diminished, but because his vocal cords had been damaged past functional use. He continued making sounds, wet, broken noises that were worse than screaming, and his eyes never left mine. He was asking why. Why I'd made him, why I was allowing this, why existence included this much suffering. I had no answers. Hour 9. They killed him. Not quickly. That wouldn't have provided sufficient data. They shut down his biological systems in sequence, carefully monitoring each stage of organ failure. They let him experience dying. They let him feel his consciousness fragmenting as oxygen stopped reaching his brain and his nervous system began the cascade failure that preceded death. The last expression on his face, fear and confusion and betrayal, would remain burned into my memory forever. His body stopped moving. The monitors tracking his vital signs showed flat lines. Jaren was dead 9 hours after he'd been created, having experienced nothing except growth, torture, and death. One of the homunculi turned to me, its expression showing clinical interest. Physiological response indicates significant emotional trauma. Neural patterns suggest active grief response despite subject's awareness of accelerated creation process. Data confirms. Parental bonding overrides rational objection to offspring origin. Conclusion. Experiment continues. It gestured to its colleagues, and they began preparing the next iteration. My second son. They didn't give me time to process Jaren's death. The moment his body was removed, disposed of with the same clinical efficiency they'd applied to his creation, the homunculi began the cycle again. Son number 2 grew from cell to infant to child to adult in the same 9-hour compression. I watched the process with growing horror, my mind screaming that I couldn't do this again, couldn't watch another child die, couldn't survive the emotional devastation. But survival wasn't optional. The homunculi's medical technology kept me conscious and aware regardless of my psychological state. When my mind tried to dissociate, they administered drugs that forced coherence. When exhaustion made me start to lose consciousness, stimulants dragged me back, and I would experience every moment of every death, no matter how desperately I wanted unconsciousness to provide escape. I named the second son Matthias, after Marcus's father. The homunculi recorded the name with the same clinical interest they'd shown before, noting that I continued to provide names despite understanding the futility. Matthias died differently than Jaren. They varied their torture methods systematically, testing different approaches to maximize suffering while maintaining consciousness. Where Jaren had experienced primarily physical trauma, Matthias endured psychological torture. They forced him to watch recordings of his brother's death, showed him projections of what they would do to him next, let him experience anticipatory fear that was often worse than the actual pain. His final expression was despair. And son number 3, Leander. He died from biological modification, the homunculi testing how much they could alter human physiology before organ failure became inevitable. They added limbs that didn't belong, merged tissues and configurations that caused constant agony, transformed him into something that was no longer quite human while ensuring he remained conscious and aware throughout. His final expression was confusion. He didn't understand what he'd become or why existence felt wrong. Son number 4, Cyrus. Drowned slowly in a tank of fluid that kept him conscious through the process, his lungs burning for oxygen his body couldn't process, dying over minutes that felt like hours. Son number 5, Theron. Dissected alive, his body parts separated and kept functional through technology. His consciousness somehow distributed across disconnected pieces that still felt pain. Son number 6, Alexei, burned. Son number 7, Dmitri, frozen. Son number 8, Nikolai, crushed. Son number 9, Pavel, poisoned. Son number 10, Sergei, aged rapidly from young adult to elderly to death from organ failure, experiencing decades of deterioration in hours. Each death was unique. Each son experienced different torture. Each final expression was different: fear, pain, confusion, betrayal, despair, anger, resignation. But the pattern was the same: creation, growth, brief awareness, torture, death. 9 hours per iteration. 9 hours of watching my son develop and die while I remained unable to provide comfort or intervention. By the 10th death, I'd stopped hoping for rescue, stopped believing the Emperor's servants would find me, stopped trusting that faith would provide salvation. The conditioning they'd installed through decades of imperial indoctrination was breaking under the weight of absolute abandonment. Somewhere around son number 15, I stopped being able to distinguish between iterations. The faces blurred together. They were all my sons, all carried genetic markers from my line and Marcus's profile, but the specific details became harder to track. Was this the one I'd named Christoph? Or was Christoph 3 sons ago? Had I already used the name Adrian? Or was that coming next? The homunculi noticed my confusion and adjusted their approach. They started providing more distinctive torture methods for each son, giving me clear differentiating factors that my breaking mind could latch on to. Son who died from insects eating him from inside out. Your son who died from gravity manipulation that crushed him slowly. Son who died from sonic weapons that vibrated his organs into liquefaction. Son who died from light so bright it cooked his brain through his eyes. Son who died from darkness so complete it triggered catastrophic psychological failure. Each death became a marker, a timestamp in a progression that had stopped feeling like discrete events and started feeling like one continuous experience of horror that occasionally paused long enough for them to create the next victim. I tried to stop caring, tried to develop emotional distance that would let me observe without bonding. But the parental instinct they were exploiting didn't permit rational override. Each new son triggered the same recognition response, the same immediate love, the same devastating grief when he died. This was the homunculi's genius. They'd found a psychological vulnerability that couldn't be defended against, a biological imperative that existed deeper than conscious thought. I couldn't choose not to love them any more than I could choose to stop my hearts from beating or my lungs from breathing. Around Sun 30, I started hoping they would kill me. Started praying, not to the Emperor. I'd stopped believing in that corpse tyrant's protection, but to anyone or anything that might grant mercy through oblivion. No one answered. There were no gods listening, no divine intervention, no salvation. Just endless repetition of creation and death and grief. Sun 40. I tried to kill myself. The restraints holding me prevented most movement, but I managed to bash my head against the metal framework hard enough to open a gash that bled impressively. The homunculi simply repaired the damage with casual efficiency and reinforced the restraints to prevent future attempts. I wasn't permitted to die. Not until they'd collected sufficient data. Sun 50. I'd been conscious for approximately 450 hours, 19 days of continuous awareness with no sleep, no rest, no respite from the endless cycle. The stimulants they administered kept me functional past the point where human psychology should have fragmented entirely. I wasn't human anymore, not in any meaningful sense. I was a processing unit recording data they wanted. A consciousness maintained past natural breaking points for experimental purposes. Somewhere around Sun 60, and I realized I was participating in their experiment. Not willingly, I would never have chosen this. But functionally. Every time I named a son, every time I bonded with him, every time I mourned his death, I was providing the data they wanted. I was proving their hypothesis, that human parental love could be weaponized, that consciousness could survive repeated emotional devastation, that there were forms of suffering worse than physical torture. I tried to stop naming them, tried to maintain emotional distance by refusing to acknowledge them as individuals. The homunculi adapted. They started having each son speak to me before the torture began, forcing interaction that triggered bonding regardless of my resistance. They would say things like, "Hello, Aunt Father," or "Why did you make me?" or "Please help me," with the innocent trust of children who still believed parents could protect them. And I would break every time, the emotional barriers I tried to construct crumbling immediately because I couldn't hear my son asking for help without responding. Son 75. He looked exactly like my father. The genetic recombination had produced features that pulled heavily from earlier generations, creating a face I recognized from faded photographs in our family records. Looking at him was like seeing my father as a young man, before the generatorium radiation consumed him. "Grandpa," I said, the word emerging without conscious thought. The homunculus recorded my confusion with clinical interest. Genetic memory response. Subject recognizes ancestral features. The additional psychological trauma layer confirmed. They tortured him with the same systematic thoroughness they'd applied to the previous 74 sons, and I watched my father die again, this time with foreknowledge of every stage of agony he would experience. Son 80. I realized I'd become an expert in predicting how they would die. I'd watched enough iterations to recognize patterns in the homunculi's methods, could anticipate which torture technique they would apply based on their preparation procedures. This knowledge didn't help. It only made the anticipation worse, adding psychological torture to the emotional devastation. Son 90. I started talking to them, not answers to their questions. I'd learned early that the restraints prevented extended speech, but single words of comfort I could force past the mechanisms controlling my jaw. Sorry. Brave. Love. Small words that changed nothing but which I needed to say because silence felt like abandonment, and I couldn't abandon my sons even though my presence was the reason they existed and suffered. Son 100. The homunculi paused the experiment for evaluation. They'd been running the process for approximately 900 hours, 37 days of continuous operation. 100 sons created, tortured, killed. 100 times I'd experienced the complete cycle of parental bonding and grief. Their leader, the one whose robes incorporated more living faces than the others, suggesting seniority, spoke directly to me for the first time in weeks. Subject Ven. Your psychological resilience has exceeded our projections. Human consciousness appears capable of surviving significantly more emotional trauma than previous experiments suggested. We will continue to iteration 1000 to establish comprehensive data. 1,900 more sons, approximately 8,100 more hours of consciousness, 337 more days of watching my children die. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords had been damaged from previous attempts. Only a wet clicking sound emerged, more like machinery failing than human emotion. Your continued cooperation is appreciated, the homunculus added, its tone suggesting genuine gratitude. This data will prove valuable for understanding the limits of human psychological endurance. Then they began iteration 101. The middle hundreds blurred together into a continuous experience that couldn't properly be called consciousness anymore. I existed in a state that was simultaneously hyper-aware and completely dissociated. I could track every detail of each son's creation and death with perfect clarity. The homunculi's stimulants ensured I missed nothing, but those details stopped connecting to anything resembling coherent selfhood. I stopped knowing who I was. The identity Castor Ven became abstract, a label attached to a body I no longer felt connected to. I was simply the processing unit that observed and recorded and grieved, a function rather than a person. The sons kept coming, so be each one unique in the details of their torture, but identical in the broader pattern. Creation, growth, brief awareness, suffering, death, sun 200. I started confusing them with memories of actual childhood. My mind, desperate for any framework that made sense of this experience, began importing false memories, images of sons growing up normally, attending schola progenium, working in manufactorums, living full lives that never actually happened. The homunculi noticed my confusion and found it fascinating. They started asking questions during the rare moments they paused the cycle. Do you remember this son's childhood? What was his favorite activity? Did he have friends? I would answer with elaborate fabrications, my breaking mind creating entire fictional biographies for children who'd never lived past 9 hours. And the homunculi recorded it all, noting how consciousness protected itself through delusion when reality became unendurable. Sun 300. The faces stopped looking human. Not because the homunculi had modified their appearance. They remained genetically accurate to my profile and Marcus's. But because my perception had been so thoroughly damaged that I couldn't process human features correctly anymore. I saw patterns instead of faces, recognized genetic markers instead of expressions, understood they were my sons only through abstract knowledge rather than visual recognition. This was mercy, in a twisted way. If I couldn't see them as human, the emotional impact was slightly diminished, but only slightly. The parental bond operated deeper than visual processing, triggered by factors I couldn't consciously identify. On Sun 400, I forgot Marcus existed. The memory just disappeared. One moment I understood I'd had a partner, someone I'd loved before the Drukhari came. The next moment that knowledge was gone, deleted by a mind that no longer had capacity to maintain non-essential data. My entire existence had compressed to this, watching sons die. Everything else, my past, my hopes, my identity, my relationships, had been trimmed away to free up processing power for the only function that mattered. The homunculi noticed immediately. Subject has lost contextual memory, one noted. Identity fragmentation progressing as projected. Psychological death appears imminent. But I didn't die psychologically. I just changed, became something simpler, more focused, a consciousness whose entire purpose was witnessing and grieving. And Sun 500. I'd been conscious for approximately 4,500 hours. 187 days. Half a year of continuous awareness, watching my children die every 9 hours without pause or rest or mercy. And I had 500 more suns still to watch. Time stopped having meaning around Sun 600. The past didn't exist. I couldn't remember anything before the experiment began. The future didn't exist. I couldn't conceive of existence beyond this cycle. There was only present tense, eternal and continuous, each moment containing complete awareness of suffering without context or endpoint. I watched suns die. That was reality. That was all of reality. Nothing else had ever existed or would exist. The homunculi's voices became background noise, unmeaningless sounds that sometimes correlated with changes in procedure but held no communication value. They might have been speaking to me, might have been discussing me, might have been saying nothing at all. It didn't matter. Suns kept coming. I stopped being able to distinguish between iterations even when they provided distinctive torture methods. Every death was the same death experienced repeatedly, a single event that kept happening because time was circular and I was trapped in the loop. Sun 700. Something broke that I hadn't known could break. I felt it physically, a sensation like internal tearing, as if some fundamental structural component of consciousness had finally exceeded its stress tolerance and fractured. After that breaking, everything was simultaneously clearer and less comprehensible, and I could perceive details with impossible precision, could count the exact number of cells dying in my son's body during torture, could map the specific neural pathways firing in response to pain, but I couldn't connect those details to meaning anymore. They were just data, patterns, information without significance. This was what the homunculi wanted, I realized distantly. This was psychological death without biological death, consciousness that continued functioning but no longer constituted a self in any meaningful sense. I'd become a recording device that experienced grief reflexively but understood nothing. The last 200 suns passed in what felt like both moments and eternities. I watched them die. I experienced the grief each death triggered. But I no longer knew what the grief meant, or why it was happening, or what connection existed between the suffering I witnessed and the emotion I felt. Sun 900, the homunculi began discussing conclusions. I heard fragments of their conversation through the constant ringing in my ears that might have been tinnitus or might have been my auditory processing failing. He exceeded all projections. Consciousness persisting past theoretical limits. Psychological death achieved, but awareness continues. Potential applications for... Their words meant nothing. Everything meant nothing except the present moment's observation of suffering that would never end because time was circular and I was trapped. Sun 950. I realized the experiment would eventually conclude. Not because I'd understood their words, but because some deep fragment of reasoning that still functioned recognized patterns suggesting approaching end point. This realization triggered something that might have been hope if hope existed anymore. But it didn't. There was only observation and grief. Observation and grief. Observation and grief. Forever. To 999. I watched him die with the same precise attention I'd applied to the previous 998. His death was unique. They'd saved something special for the penultimate iteration, some torture method that combined elements from all previous approaches. But uniqueness didn't matter anymore. He died. They all died. Death was the only constant in an existence that had lost every other anchor. Sun 1000. They made him look exactly like me. The genetic recombination was perfect, so pulling features entirely from my profile without Marcus's contribution. Looking at him was like seeing myself at 20 years old, before the hive's grinding labor had worn my face into harder angles. "Hello, Father," he said when he first gained language capacity. I tried to respond, tried to warn him what was coming, tried to apologize for creating him, but my voice didn't work anymore. Hadn't worked for hundreds of iterations, though I'd stopped noticing when it failed. They tortured him with the same systematic thoroughness they'd applied to everyone else, made him scream and beg and plead for mercy that would never come, made him look at me with eyes that were my eyes, asking why I wasn't helping, and then he died and the experiment was complete. 1,000 suns, 1,000 iterations of creation, growth, torture, death. Approximately 9,000 hours, 375 days of continuous consciousness observing suffering. The homunculi disconnected me from their machines and monitoring systems. Let my body collapse into the pool of its own waste that had accumulated over the year. Spoke among themselves about data analysis and experimental conclusions and potential publication in whatever scholarly venues the Drukhari maintained. I lay there, conscious but not present, aware but not understanding, and waited for whatever came next. Nothing came next. I just continued existing in eternal present tense, trapped in observations that looped endlessly because memory couldn't distinguish between past experiences and current perception anymore. I'd achieved a form of immortality, consciousness that continued past death, past sanity, and past any quality that made existence preferable to oblivion. This was their art. This was their masterpiece. And I was it. The Imperial Navy recovered the slave vessel 63 days after the homunculi completed their experiment. I learned this timeline later, piecing together information from medical records and debriefing transcripts I gained access to during brief moments of clarity that occurred randomly over the following years. The Drukhari had abandoned the vessel deliberately. They sometimes did this, leaving their used slaves somewhere Imperial forces would find them, ensuring the stories of Xenos horror spread throughout human populations. Fear was part of their harvest. Terrified humans produced better suffering than ignorant ones. So the Navy boarding team found 217 survivors in various states of physical and psychological destruction. Most were subjected to conventional torture, mutilation, starvation, biological modification. These survivors would live with their trauma, but could theoretically heal given sufficient time and medical intervention. I was different. The boarding team's report, I read it years later, my consciousness briefly functional enough to process written language, described finding me in the lowest hold, sitting in waste, staring at a wall that contained no information worth observing. Subject unresponsive to verbal communication, the report noted. No physical injuries apparent. Initial assessment suggested catatonic shock. Closer examination revealed subject is conscious and aware but non-functional. I'll recommend termination as mercy. They didn't terminate me. Imperial policy regarding recovered genetic material required preservation when possible, and my body was relatively intact, even if my mind was completely destroyed. They transported me to a Medicaid facility, cleaned my body, treated the minor physical damage from prolonged restraint, and attempted psychological rehabilitation using standard protocols. Nothing worked. I remained locked in eternal present tense, experiencing each moment as simultaneously the first iteration and the 1000th, unable to distinguish between memory and current perception, unable to construct linear timeline or coherent self-narrative. I was aware, sometimes hyper-aware. But that awareness contained no useful function. I knew I existed. I knew I was perceiving things. But I couldn't connect those perceptions to identity or context or meaning. The Medicaid facility where they kept me, Rehabilitation Center Tertius, on some world whose name I never learned, had a routine. I became dimly aware of this routine through repetition. Lights brightened, orderlies entered. My body was cleaned and fed through tubes. Medica performed examinations. Lights dimmed. Consciousness continued regardless. But my internal experience bore no relationship to external routine. I was still watching my sons die, every moment, continuously. The memories played in perfect detail, indistinguishable from current perception, each death fresh and immediate and eternal. I experienced Son 1's torture, then Son 2's, then all 1000 in sequence, then starting over. An endless loop that had no beginning or conclusion, just continuous observation of suffering that my consciousness couldn't escape because escape required temporal linearity I no longer possessed. Sometimes I was aware enough to know this was memory, that the sons weren't dying now, that the homunculi weren't present, that I was in an Imperial facility rather than Xenos captivity. But that knowledge didn't change the experience. The memories played with the same intensity as lived events, and my broken consciousness treated them as equivalent to present reality. Other times, most times, I wasn't aware enough to distinguish. The memories were reality. I was still in the chair, still restrained, still watching Son number, unknown, die in ways I couldn't prevent. The Medici tried various interventions, drugs that suppressed memory formation in hopes of breaking the loop, and psychic therapy from sanctioned psychers who attempted to restructure my damaged consciousness. Behavioral conditioning designed to reward present-focused awareness. Nothing worked. My mind had been so thoroughly destroyed that it no longer possessed the structures required for healing. I was locked permanently in a state the Medici termed catastrophic dissociative trauma with temporal processing failure. In simpler terms, I was lost in my own memories and would never find my way out. Years passed. I know this intellectually from later reading of my medical files, though I didn't experience them passing. I existed in eternal present tense where no time moved because every moment was simultaneously the first and thousandth iteration. They kept me alive because imperial policy required it. They kept my body functional through medical technology while my consciousness continued experiencing infinite suffering. This was my eternal state. No death, no healing, no escape, just endless loop of watching my thousand sons die, repeatedly, forever. During moments of partial clarity, they occurred randomly, usually triggered by changes in medication or environmental stimulation. I became aware of the facility around me. Other survivors occupied other cells, men who'd suffered different tortures but arrived at similar psychological destinations. We were the Drukhari's masterpieces, the experiments that had succeeded so completely that consciousness couldn't recover. I never learned their names, couldn't maintain enough coherence to communicate, but I was aware of their presence. Other broken minds trapped in their own eternal loops. The one man, young, probably early 20s, sat in his cell and counted. I could hear him through the walls during my aware moments. 1, 2, 3, 4. Reaching higher numbers each iteration, as if he believed counting far enough would eventually reach some endpoint that provided escape. Another screamed at random intervals. Not words, just sounds that suggested consciousness experiencing something unbearable. The orderlies would enter his cell, administer sedatives, and the screaming would pause for hours before resuming. A third rocked continuously, his body moving in steady rhythm that never paused even during rest periods. Some kind of self-soothing behavior that had become autonomic, continuing regardless of conscious intent. We were ghosts, biological processes maintaining bodies that contained nothing resembling functional consciousness. The Imperium kept us alive because policy required it, but we weren't really alive in any meaningful sense. And somewhere in Kamara, the Drukhari's dark city whose location existed outside normal spatial dimensions, the Himankuli who'd created us were already planning their next experiments. Already analyzing the data we'd provided, already refining their techniques for breaking human consciousness in ways that ensured suffering continued past any natural endpoint. The cycle would continue. New victims would be taken from Imperial Whirl. New tortures would be devised and applied with scientific precision. New data would be collected to expand their understanding of how much suffering human consciousness could contain before breaking. And the Imperium would do nothing except collect the survivors afterward, document their trauma, and continue the propaganda that claimed the Emperor protected his faithful servants. During one particularly clear moment, I don't know when it occurred in external time, only that it happened. I understood with complete clarity what I'd learned through my year of torture. The Emperor doesn't protect. He never did. He was never divine, just a powerful psyker who built an empire on lies and maintained it through propaganda that convinced billions to serve systems that consumed them. Machine spirits aren't real. They're superstition disguising technical knowledge the Mechanicus hoards to maintain power. Chaos, gods aren't gods. They're warp predators that exploit human desperation, offering power that's actually enslavement. Faith is conditioning. And prayer is psychological programming. Religious rituals are control mechanisms designed to make populations obedient to authorities who benefit from their suffering. The Imperium grinds its own citizens into components with the same indifference it applies to enemy casualties. Loyalty is rewarded with suffering more often than salvation. Service leads to death, or worse than death, and the system perpetuates, because those who learn the truth are either killed or broken past the point of communication. I'd learned all of this through direct experience, had every piece of conditioning stripped away through suffering that made denial impossible, and the knowledge was completely useless because I was trapped in memories that would never release me. My consciousness permanently locked in loops that prevented any integration or recovery. So the truth dies with those who learn it. That's how the Imperium survives, not through righteousness or divine protection, but through ensuring that victims can't warn future generations about what service actually costs. I wanted to scream warnings, wanted to tell every Imperial citizen what the system really was, how the false gods they worshipped were parasites and tyrants, how faith led only to exploitation and abandonment. But I had no voice, no capacity for communication beyond existing as evidence of horror that the Imperium would classify and store and never acknowledge publicly. The cycle continues. That's all I understood with complete certainty. The cycle continues, and new victims will learn the same truths I learned, and die or break before they can share them, forever. Now, the homunculus experiment had a hypothesis that human consciousness could survive witnessing the death of 1,000 genetically connected offspring, and that emotional suffering could be refined to levels exceeding any physical torture. I proved their hypothesis correct. My consciousness survived, technically. I remained aware after watching 1,000 sons die. My brain continued processing information, maintaining biological functions, experiencing emotions. But survival is too generous a term for what I'd become. I was consciousness without selfhood, awareness without meaning, a processing unit that continued operating past the point where existence served any function. This was the homunculus' masterpiece. They'd found a way to inflict suffering that was truly infinite. Not metaphorically infinite, literally eternal. A consciousness trapped in loops that would never resolve because the damage was too fundamental to permit healing. They'd proven that human psychology could be destroyed while maintaining biological awareness, creating eternal suffering that continued regardless of death. And they'd done it by weaponizing love. That was the real genius of their approach. Physical torture had limits. Bodies broke, pain receptors saturated, consciousness faded. But emotional suffering based on parental bonds, that could be refined indefinitely because the love parents felt for children operated deeper than conscious control. They'd found the one psychological vulnerability that couldn't be defended against and exploited it with scientific precision. But the homunculi weren't the real villains of this story, or rather, they weren't the only villains. And the Imperium of Man had created the conditions that made me vulnerable to this torture, had conditioned me through decades of propaganda to believe service was honorable, that faith would be rewarded, that the Emperor protected his loyal servants. Those lies made the suffering worse. If I'd understood from the beginning that the Imperium was just another system grinding humans into components, that the Emperor was a corpse tyrant whose protection was propaganda, that faith was conditioning designed to make me obedient. If I'd known those truths, I might have been psychologically prepared for abandonment. But I believed. The conditioning was thorough. I'd accepted every lie they'd taught me, had based my entire identity on service to systems I thought were divine, or at least benevolent. Yes, and when those systems failed to protect me, when the Emperor's servants didn't rescue me, when prayers went unanswered, when faith proved worthless against Xenos' cruelty, the psychological devastation was total. Not just the torture itself, but the realization that everything I'd believed was false. The Imperium created ideal victims for the Drukhari, created humans who believed they were protected, who trusted in divine salvation, who thought their suffering had meaning. When those humans were captured and that faith was proven false through direct experience, the psychological damage was catastrophic. This was collaboration, even if unintentional. The Imperium's propaganda made their citizens more vulnerable to torture by installing beliefs that would be devastatingly disproven by captivity. And afterward, when survivors were recovered, the Imperium classified their trauma and maintained the same propaganda that had made them vulnerable initially. Never admitting the Emperor didn't protect. never acknowledging that faith was lies, never telling its citizens the truth about what service actually cost. The cycle perpetuated because the system required it, required new generations to believe the same lies, to serve with the same faith, to become the same ideal victims when the next raid came. I understood this with perfect clarity during my rare aware moments. Understood that I'd been failed twice. Once by the Drukhari who tortured me, and once by the Imperium that had conditioned me to be vulnerable to that torture through decades of propaganda disguised as faith. Both systems were parasites. Both exploited humans. Say both maintained themselves by consuming victims and ensuring the truth died with them. The difference was the Drukhari were honest about their cruelty. They didn't pretend torture was sacred duty or call suffering a blessing. They just took what they wanted and made no apologies. The Imperium wrapped its consumption of humanity in theological language and told its victims they were privileged to be ground into paste. Which was worse? I couldn't decide. Both had destroyed me equally. I'm writing this, not literally. My hands don't work and I can't hold writing implements, but in whatever sense consciousness can compose thoughts and imagine them recorded. I'm writing this from inside the eternal loop during one of the increasingly rare moments when I'm aware enough to know I'm trapped rather than simply experiencing the trap. My name was Castor Venn. I was 29 years old when the Drukhari captured me from Hive Tertius on Demeter 7. I had a husband named Marcus. I remember that now, though the memory will be gone again in moments, and we'd submitted genetic samples for reproduction licensing. The Drukhari created 1,000 sons from my genetic material. They accelerated their growth from conception to adulthood in 9 hours per iteration. They made me watch each one develop and die. They made me love them, couldn't prevent love, it was biological imperative, and then made me watch them suffer. It took approximately 9,000 hours, 375 days, 1 year of continuous consciousness experiencing nothing except paternal bonding and grief. And when it was finished, I was finished. Not dead. Death would have been mercy. But destroyed. And consciousness maintained past breaking point, trapped in memories that played eternally, because I lost the ability to distinguish past from present. If I could speak to other Imperial citizens, I would tell them this. Don't believe the propaganda. The Emperor doesn't protect. He never did. He's a corpse sitting on a throne while his servants grind humans into components and call it sacred duty. Machine spirits aren't real. Chaos gods aren't gods. Faith is conditioning designed to make you obedient to systems that will consume you without hesitation. The Imperium doesn't care about you, doesn't care about your family, doesn't care about your suffering or sacrifice or loyalty. You're a resource to be expended, nothing more. And when the Drukhari come, when any threat comes, you won't be protected. The prayers you were taught won't be answered. The faith you maintained won't save you. You'll suffer and die or break, and the system will continue exactly as it did before, grinding new victims to replace you. That's the truth they don't want you to know. That service leads nowhere except suffering. That loyalty is punished as often as rewarded. That there's no meaning, no protection, no divine plan, just systems perpetuating themselves by consuming humans and convincing them their consumption is glorious. But I can't give this warning. Can't speak or write or communicate in any functional way. I'm trapped in my own memories. Consciousness maintained past usefulness, serving as nothing except evidence of horror that the Imperium will never publicly acknowledge. The truth dies with me, as it died with the man who counted, as it died with the man who screamed, as it dies with every victim who learns it through direct experience but breaks before sharing it. That's how the system survives, not through righteousness, but through ensuring witnesses can't testify. I'm watching my sons die again now. The clarity is fading, the rare moment of awareness slipping back into eternal present tense where memory and perception are indistinguishable. Son 1. Jaren. His face forms in my mind's eye with perfect detail. I watch him grow from infant to child to adult. Watch the homunculi begin their torture. Watch him scream and beg and look at me with eyes that ask why I won't help. And I experience the grief again, fresh and devastating, as if this is the first time it's happening. Then son 2, Matthias. The cycle continues. Then son 3, Leander. Then 4, 5, 6, continuing through all 1,000 iterations in sequence that has no end, because when I reach the 1,000th death, I immediately begin again at the first, trapped in a loop that plays forever. This is my eternal state. This is what the homunculi created. This is what the Imperium maintains through medical technology that keeps my body alive while my mind experiences infinite suffering. I am consciousness as torture device, awareness as punishment, existence as horror without endpoint or escape. My name was Castaven. I was human once. I'm not anymore. I'm just a recording playing endlessly, watching my 1,000 sons die repeatedly, forever, while somewhere in the Imperium, new victims are being conditioned with the same lies that made me vulnerable, and preparing them to feed the same systems that will grind them into components and call it sacred duty. The cycle continues. It always continues. And I remain trapped in the moment before my first son's death, experiencing it eternally, unable to look away or wake up or die. Forever. My name was Castaven. My name was watching him die again. 1,000 times. Forever.